And thanks for getting started, everyone, on the polling. It's fun to see where everyone is coming in from, what sorts of backgrounds we'll have today with us. Awesome. So we're going to get started. I'm just going to very briefly, turn on my video, although it doesn't seem to be turning on. So I'm going to say hello to everyone. There you go. So I am Carrie Nemi. I am the program director on the design team. So first of all, I just wanted to say hello and have you at least see my face for a minute, and before we kind of start the welcome here. So hello and welcome. As I said, I'm Carrie Nemi, program director on Enterprise's design team. We are so glad to be here with you today. Today's webinar is an introduction to the newest addition to Enterprise's Resource Library and Enterprise's Design Matters Resource Library, 10 ways to make the most of your design team. And this is a resource that's been a long time coming. Every year at the Affordable Housing Design Leadership Institute, our participants share how useful it is to understand how to better communicate with their architects and landscape architects. And this resource, written by architect developers, is designed to help you maximize your design team at every stage of your project. Today, and in the resource, we're going to cover common pitfalls we see in the industry and ways you can avoid them by being intentional, transparent, and collaborative in your relationship with your architect. And before we get started, I'd just like to say we're honored to be together with you on this webinar today. We are living in unprecedented and stressful times with a lot filling people's hearts and minds. So it means a lot to join together in lifting up what could be possible for affordable housing, even amidst all this. And we understand that many couldn't join us, so we will be recording today's session, and we've already started that recording, and sharing it by email with everyone who registered, as well as posting it on our website. So now for a quick technical orientation. So you'll find the Q&A box on the side. If you have questions or comments as we're going through the slides, please type them right into the chat box. You can either direct them to myself if you want to keep it personal, or to the whole group, so to the benefit of everyone. And we'll take a quick break after each webinar section to answer a few questions, and hopefully at the end we'll also have some additional time for Q&A. And your questions are really valuable to us as a team because they also show us where there might be demand for a future resource. So even if we don't get to them today, please keep the questions coming, as we're looking always how to answer your questions in blog posts, resources. In terms of audio, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a headset, and you can change your audio there to your phone or to your computer. If you have a spotty internet connection, I'd recommend switching over to your phone audio. And finally, as I said, today this will be recorded, and the recordings of this webinar will be sent to all the attendees and posted on the Design Matters Resource Library. And joining other resources such as our pre-development design toolkit, which guides you through the process of writing a design brief and hiring a new architect, and our guidelines, the design guidelines, and many other resources that we've worked on over the years. So the authors of this resource are all architects who have worked or are currently working as affordable housing developers as part of the Enterprise Rose Fellowship. With firsthand knowledge of the struggles on both sides of the project team, they are uniquely equipped to author this guide, and we were really lucky to work with them on it. And just to say a few words about the fellowship and the experience that these three fellows are bringing. The Enterprise Rose Fellowship is guided by an innovative model which partners architects, landscape architects, and community engaged artists as full-time employees with community development organizations across the country to facilitate an inclusive approach to development that results in sustainable, healthy, and affordable communities. This year, the program celebrates 20 years. So this resource capturing one of the types of deep learning from the fellowship feels very well timed. And just specifically, to know some of the background that these three individuals are bringing and the geographic diversity, which I think is, was very appreciated by us. Nick Forrest is an experienced designer working with Quest Community Development. His work centers on assisting Quest with developing affordable housing in Atlanta's rapidly gentrifying West Side neighborhoods. Kelsey Ostman is a licensed architect and design initiatives manager at Urban Housing Solutions in Nashville and the creator of The Game of Rent. And Leah Oxenhandler-Litvin is a licensed architect and lead accredited professional. She's founding partner of LO Design and completed her fellowship with People's Emergency Center, CDC, in Philadelphia. So welcome to the call to our speakers, and from there I'm going to hand it off to them.
Thanks, Carrie. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Carrie mentioned, the resource we've created, we are uniquely positioned to create the resource because we're all former or current Enterprise Rose Fellows, and we all have architectural backgrounds. But throughout our 3-year fellowship, we have worked or currently work as project managers within development entities. Enterprise always calls us the boots on the ground that can learn from our experiences working in nonprofit housing organizations and community development corporations and report back to a wider audience. This is where the idea for this particular resource originated, and we're very excited to share our work with you. Essentially, we've organized this resource chronologically, mirroring the sequence of the development process from planning to design to construction and project closeout. We wanted to make the resource as valuable as possible and relevant to a real-world workflow. Recognizing that affordable housing projects are rarely so linear, some of these tips will be relevant at multiple stages along the way.
There are so many different pieces and parts of the development process, and we see these 10 ways as a set of tips, strategies, and action items that you can use in your toolbox as a developer. As we'll talk about in the first tip, every project is unique, which means that there will be unique opportunities to integrate these action items into your projects and processes. These strategies are sourced from our own experiences in design and development, which we'll share through anecdotes along the way, as well as the experience of colleagues, both former Rose Fellows and other folks in the industry, to give some examples of these strategies in action. And again, after each section, we'll pause to take any questions or comments from the chat box, so please do drop those in there for us as we go along. And Nick will kick us off with strategies to consider during planning.
Thank you, Kelsey. And once again, welcome everyone. The first section of the guide we'll discuss is the planning phase. There's a saying that 90% of the decisions are made in the first 10% of the project, which means the planning stage is a critical place that has a ton of impact on your project. This segment will cover things like architect selection, programming, performas, and research to set yourself up for success in the rest of your project. So let's get started. Tip number one, not all architects are equal. We often see that nonprofits or development entities tend to use the architects and firms they are most familiar with. This can be useful in some ways, like if you have a strong working relationship with the designer who already understands your priorities and strategies. Trust is really important and can take time and effort to build with a new design team, but limiting yourself to the same designers could limit you in your projects. It's okay to use the same design on multiple projects, but if you do, make sure it's intentional. So don't default to the same familiar firms. New relationships can open new results. Be on the lookout for designers or projects you like. Contact your local AIA and NOMA chapters, or release an RFP for design services. For a template, see the pre-development design toolkit on the Enterprise Resource Library. Budget adequately for design fees. Leave room to select your project partner on more than price alone. And consider the whole design team. The landscape architect, engineers, and other consultants play a big role in your project quality and budget. If you interview prospective architects, be sure to meet with those representatives too.
And this tip really comes from personal experience. About 2 years ago, our organization was about to take on our first dedicated senior affordable housing project. And we had existing relationships with a couple of local designers and had done successful projects with them before. But we knew that with this particular population, it was going to be really important for us to find a designer who had a lot of experience working with that end user and their unique needs, somebody that could help us think through all the details to really maximize this project. We wanted to cast a wider net, so we ended up conducting an RFP using that template from the Enterprise Resource Library, and that connected us with a couple of different firms, including the one that we ended up working with. So now we're about to finish construction on this project in about 2 months, and we're really pleased with this new relationship that we've built.
Our next step within the planning phase is poor direction leads to poor design. We all know architects that can create amazing buildings and designs, but these structures aren't developed without the guidance from the owner. Your program gives your architect the direction they need in order to design the development that you've dreamt of and that best fits your needs. So in order to achieve this, be clear about your priorities. Write a project mission or goal statement that makes your programmatic priorities clear. Down the road, this reduces value engineering, or at least makes it a lot easier. Make a detailed list of all the areas and amenities you anticipate needing. It's easier to eliminate elements than to try to fit them in later. And focus on the end users, both residents and support staff. Develop your program using interviews, surveys, or other engagement strategies. Good design is a function of knowing who you are designing for. Planning tip number 3, be transparent about money matters. Sharing your budget can be scary, but if you want to reduce the chances of any financial hurdles down the road, it's best to review your budgetary constraints and limitations with your design team. Being transparent looks like letting your design team in on deadlines or requirements for funding applications, especially if you will need drawings or renderings. Share your budget early and often. If funding resources fall through or change, let your design team know as soon as possible. Write any funding source design requirements or priorities into the program so your design team has them from day one. And your architect can help you meet financial goals. Discuss phasing options and other design and construction alternatives with them as well.
Now, this issue is something we come across often, both in an architect's role and as developers. There are a lot of reasons you might think it's beneficial as a developer to keep financial decisions from your architect. Like maybe you don't think it's relevant or you don't want to add to their overall fee, but you might not share things like your full development budget, or on smaller projects, even your construction bids. When you don't share these items, you might not realize you're actually leaving out big pieces of the puzzle. So if your architect isn't contracted to run the bidding process, your contractor could be making incorrect assumptions that would result in big change orders down the road. So we think this is really important.
And so our final planning tip is do your homework and come prepared. In order to provide your architect with the information they need to develop your building, you have to do the initial research to determine what it is that you're looking for. often we see developers have a very vague idea of the project they're looking for, but haven't thought through it fully just yet. How does the organization really plan to use the space? What are specific needs programmatically? What are required by the funding sources, et cetera? The questions you need to consider and ask yourself. So doing the homework involves you doing your research on best practices. Your design team will bring their own experience and expertise. You should too. Compile and analyze a list of precedent projects you admire. What do you value most about them? What would you do differently? And what are the aesthetics caught your eye? Explore the Enterprise Design Matters resource library for information about things like senior housing or active design or healthy materials. And lastly, if your organization has any design guidelines or standards, share those with your entire design team early and reference them often. So I've given you quite a few tips within this section. So to recap, remember, not all architects are equal. Diversify your team. Number 2, poor direction leads to poor design, so develop your program. Number 3, be transparent about money matters, ensure your performer and budget. And number 4, do your homework and come prepared. Do the initial research. So we'll now open it up, chat for questions.
Yes, we had a couple of similar questions that I will share in the chat box around finances. So I will put those in the chat box to everybody, but why would I share my actual full budget if I want to spend as little as possible? The architect will spend every penny that we give them. Anybody want to field that?
Yeah. So that's not entirely true. Your budget helps them to understand what you can actually afford and how they can best use their skill set and their experience and expertise to meet your budget goal. Your architect is your friend and your ally. They're not your enemy. They're not there to rip you off or take advantage of you or anything like that. So they are there to best support you to meet your goals because they want to achieve the same goals as you. So that is why it is to share, it's best to share the information with them.
Okay. If there are other questions out there, you can enter them into the chat box. Do you guys have any other anecdotes, about meetings that you've been to, for instance, this do your homework and come prepared? I mean, I think there's certainly this idea that, we're hiring a designer to do this part of the project so that we can focus on all these other components. Why does it matter that, how does this end up playing out when developers haven't done this work?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. Back to that senior project that I mentioned earlier, because it was a sort of new subset of program, if you will. We had done plenty of multifamily rental, but nothing to specifically serve older adults. And so even though we were particular about hiring an architect and a design team that had experience with that, it was still on us to figure out what amenities we wanted to offer and what was going to fit within our operational program as well. So, if a full fitness center might not be feasible for us, but what are other amenity spaces that would accommodate the kinds of programs and supportive services that we wanted to offer. So it was a kind of joint effort to bring our criteria of the spaces that we wanted, and then the architect helped us think through what are all of the other pieces that we might not be thinking of, especially from kind of an infrastructure side. But it is important to note that typically programming is not part of the architect's basic scope of services. So it's okay if you do need help thinking through those things, but just recognize that it might come at an additional fee for them to provide those services.
Awesome. And how might it end up impacting the budget if people haven't done this homework? Have you guys seen any examples of that, or like last minute changes to projects, or? Because I know that budget is always first and foremost. What people have on their minds is trying to stay within their budget.
Yeah, I can take this one. So I mean, I've seen personally in projects where the client doesn't fully think through programming early. We get down the road into design development or even construction documents, and they start adding things like, oh, we need this music room here, or, oh, we need, 5 more laundry rooms. And it ends up resulting in a lot of time doing changes late in design when the client starts to realize that not all of their stakeholders are getting what they need out of the drawings, when they start to realize this is almost final. So now I need to really run this through up the ladder and through the chain of command. Operationally, it all needs to make sense in the end. But often this isn't dealt with until later, when things are starting to feel like they're finalized, and a lot of time can be spent redoing the extensive coordination that it takes to get a building through construction documents. So I think it's really important to think about how to engage your stakeholders as a developer early on, like from within your organization and your residents, to make sure that you're covering all your bases and like what a building will need ultimately to best, serve its purpose. Are there any?
Are you ready to?
Yeah, I think if there aren't any other questions, we can continue to the next phase. So once your project is planned out and you've made your way through all of the important steps of pre-design, you're ready to start one of the most exciting parts of the development timeline, the design process. While a lot of people think of this as the fun part of development, this is often where many developers have the most trouble communicating with their design team. So we're here to help you take control of the process and make sure everyone is on the same page, so you and your organization get the results you really want and need. One of the most common issues we've seen working with developers is that there's some confusion between what an architect can do and is willing to do and what they're already being paid to do. We're here to tell you to hold your design team accountable and make sure you're not doing part of their job. We know that nonprofit developers and real estate developers in general are often teams of doers, people who want to get things done, get things built, and will do so by any means necessary. But it's really important to make sure that communication is clear, that everyone knows what they're responsible for, everyone's staying in their lanes, and that the professionals are allowed to do their job. So our fifth tip is really important because it's the foundation of design for many affordable housing developments. Engagement of residents, stakeholders, and neighbors is key to a successful project that serves the community and is well integrated within a neighborhood. Sometimes developers overlook the major benefit of having their architects and design teams involved in this process. This is usually really well received by communities because designers take the feedback directly from meetings, directly from residents, and they can integrate it into a design solution. Sometimes they can even do this in real time in face-to-face meetings. So to implement this tip, you can make sure that community engagement is fully accounted for in the budget and schedule for your project. Don't add this in at the last minute, and make sure that your designers know that they're going to be fully integrated into the development team. Have them attend community engagement events throughout the design process. This enables them to observe and listen firsthand, answering additional questions from residents and the public, and it really keeps everyone accountable to each other, especially if they're meeting residents and the public face to face. You can also create a formal feedback loop so that the community's needs can be integrated into the design at every phase of the project. Present your ideas back to the community often to ensure that nothing is lost in translation. In our sixth tip, we're reminding everyone to make the most of your design meetings. Often the most productive meetings are face-to-face, in person, but in the age of social distancing, you can use Zoom and make sure everyone turns on their cameras. Screen sharing and sketching while you're on Zoom or other video platforms is an excellent tool to make sure everyone's looking at the same thing. Sometimes we realize while we're presenting to clients that someone's on the wrong drawing sheet, so this is really important. In real world terms, what you would want to do in a meeting is ideally bring a roll of trace paper and make sure you use it. Some designers call this trace paper trash because when you're using it, nothing is precious. This allows everyone in the meeting to engage with the drawings in a democratic and interactive way. You can also ask your design team for working visuals like sketches, diagrams, or 3D images. This doesn't only help you as the developer better understand the building, but it also encourages your architects to consider what the spaces they're designing will actually look and feel like. When you're in design meetings or having phone calls, come prepared and take detailed meeting minutes. Before you come to a meeting, you should review the drawings, materials, or minutes from the prior meeting to bring yourself up to speed beforehand. You could make an agenda, or your architect can make an agenda so that the meeting stays on track and you make sure you're covering all the bases. Turn your phone off. We think it's really important that when in meetings, everyone should stay focused. Don't check your texts or emails. It's really important to stay engaged and be present during this time. Taking detailed notes on what's being discussed is also really key, and have your architect create meeting minutes from these notes and their notes. Taking meeting minutes and sending them out to the whole team clarifies the discussion. It also gets everyone on the same page and serves as a really useful record later on, months or years down the road when memories become hazy. And pro tip, for bigger projects, it's important to set a deadline that everyone has to review and approve the minutes by. So you can be absolutely sure that everyone reads them and agrees on what is recorded. And finally, it's important to insist on a schedule and reference it often, holding your team accountable to deadlines. You can do this during meetings. Always bring it with you and make sure you're checking in on deliverables and timelines to keep your project on track. It's amazing how quickly schedules start to slip in a project.
Yeah, so to speak to this, one of the first design meetings I attended with Quest, we were meeting with our architect and the interior design team specifically on the layout for our new commercial space. And so to kind of help keep things moving along, I sketched out a bubble diagram of the spaces that I thought we needed. And so this was really helpful for the architect and the design team because it prevented us from going off track and going on tangent. It allowed us to address specific questions that we had, and it also provided a spark for new ideas that the design team hadn't thought about based on our needs and concepts that we hadn't thought about as a client. And so if you can't, don't have anyone in your house that can sketch out bubble diagrams or do sketches, that's why it's important to ask for those working drawings or sketches from the architect so you can mark on those and bring those to your design meetings to get the most out of them, especially with that time with them, since it's so precious. So.
Thanks, Nick. And finally, the last tip of the design phase is to ask the tough questions. Your architect isn't just there to take your initial directive from your RFP and create drawings for construction. It really is their job to help you understand what they're doing and why. So when you talk to your architect, question things that don't make sense and challenge your design team to explain their decisions. Don't be silent or assume you don't understand just because you're not a designer. We see this really often in design meetings. And then later down the road, we get questions that should have been asked earlier. You can break the ice during design meetings with questions like, can you walk us through the building? Ask them to trace a residence path from picking up mail and taking the stairs or elevator to stopping at the laundry room or going out to walk their dog. This helps orient team members who have a difficult time reading plans, which is actually really common, even if they are full-time development professionals. Making sure everyone understands what's going on can prevent surprises down the road, or worse, changes in the field. Dive into the details like fire separations and utility rooms. Ultimately, you as the developer are responsible for the final product and will have to understand these things during construction and beyond, especially when you become the operator. And now we'll get to some questions about this phase of the project, design. Carrie, have you been able to gather any questions from the chat box?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here. What if we really don't like or disagree with what the architect is doing, even if they feel really strongly about the design? What do we do in that scenario? And I think this kind of is just in general, also builds off of this idea of how do you be confident with your designer? You know, Leah, you were just really talking about asking these tough questions. Like how do you start to build that practice? But yeah, that question and just more generally.
So I think, you know, we didn't really talk about this so much in the planning phase, but this comes in during the design phase too. We think it's really important for developers to illustrate the vision that they're looking for to their architect. The design process should be ideally a back and forth between the development team and the design team. You know, and this can be done through precedent images of projects that you like. If you've been inside another building that you think really speaks to what you're looking for, or programmatic ideas, or even just something as simple as a window type or a facade system. I think rather than just telling the architect, you know, I don't like this, I think it's really important to illustrate what it is that you don't like about the building or the specific detail or the materials that they're using, and show them an alternative that you do like, because I think that's the most productive way to gain ground in this type of conversation of like, I like and don't like, because, you know, sometimes this can be sort of subjective. But if you're able to put something behind, you know, your opinions, and really back them up with something that you think would be better, I think it creates a more productive conversation.
And I think on that same note, it's always okay to ask for another option. So if they present something and you can't quite pinpoint what you don't love about it, or you don't really know what a better alternative would be, it's always okay to say, can we look at another option? Or I'm not really sure about this. Can we look at something else? Because they do have that expertise, and being able to talk through other options, you might end up with the first thing that was presented, but at least you've gone through some other choices to be able to say, yeah, you know what, you're right, this was the best solution.
Yeah, we see that a lot at the Affordable Housing Design Leadership Institute, people going back to their design teams and saying, hey, can you show me a few different like site plans, or, you know, just like realizing that that is completely within what they should and could be doing, and getting more options on the table and not just taking what is sent their way. So I think it's really exciting you guys are pointing to that. We had another question. In the past, we've been charged additional fees by architects for renderings. What's the difference between that and the working visuals that you mentioned?
I can take that one. So often firms that do these kind of really high quality marketing type renderings will outsource those to firms who that's all they do. And that's really where the added cost is, for them to have somebody else render their visuals. So as long as you're working within the software that they are already using, whether that's something like Revit or SketchUp, it's generally pretty easy for them to grab a screenshot. So as long as you stress that It doesn't have to be fancy or formal. It can just be a picture of what they've already got on their screen. But that might be something that you want to talk with your design team with as you're going through their scope of services and looking at proposals to make sure that those kinds of things are included in the way that they generally operate. And anything above and beyond that you would use for marketing and put on your website, that'll typically be where the added fee comes in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Kelsey. It's really important when you're gathering proposals from architects to read them very carefully to understand what's included in an initial proposal and what isn't included. And you can negotiate this before your project starts, before you sign the proposal. And I think it's also a good point that when you're interviewing architects, you can interview them and ask questions like, what software are you using? How easy is it for you to grab a screenshot? You know, how do you work? Like, is your working method to produce 3D visuals to really help illustrate the project to the development team? I think these are really key questions that speak beyond, you know, what type of building has an architect designed before, but also just how do they work and how will your working relationship be? That's really important to understand as you're selecting a design firm too.
And do you guys have any thoughts on, I mean, because people do often work with the same architecture firm repeatedly and may have a good relationship that they want to take to a great relationship, like how do you start to transition an existing relationship? Because, you know, you kind of have these set ways of being. Is it at when you're signing the new contract? Is it how do you start to introduce some of these practices into existing relationships?
One thing that I really like to do is talk through these kinds of things at a kickoff meeting. Ideally, that's with your whole design team, so your landscape architect, your engineers, maybe even your contractor if you have them on board early. And that's a great way to talk about really big picture goals and vision for the project. So not necessarily getting into the details of the programming, but what do you really want to accomplish with this building beyond just providing 70 units? And that's a really great tool that Enterprise also has in the Design Matters library of being able to write a project mission and vision. And that would also be a great time to talk through some of these goals of workflow and how you're really collaborating through the design process.
Awesome. I think we'll wrap questions for this section there and hold the rest until the end.
Okay. So now that your project is designed, we'll look at a few strategies for leveraging your design team as you continue throughout construction. No matter how amazing your design team is and how good their construction documents are, there are always going to be field conditions, market changes, weather delays, and other unforeseen factors that you'll have to contend with. I mean, take COVID-19, for example. And these factors require decisions and adjustments to be made in the field, which has the potential to really disrupt your project. So having a collaborative dynamic with your project team will help make sure that all of that work you put into planning and designing the project comes to fruition during construction without sacrificing quality. So our tip number 8 is communication is key. Write it down. You might have noticed a common thread throughout some of these earlier strategies that many of them boil down to communication. This is particularly important during construction where there are a lot of moving parts, and it's so important to thoroughly document and distribute those meeting notes and other documents to make sure that everybody's staying on the same page. We might assume that everyone will remember what is discussed the same way, but that can be dangerous when projects last months or years, and you might even have team members who turn over along the way. So a couple of strategies to help with communication. It might be helpful to assign. Yeah?
I think the slides might be lagging.
Okay. Are you seeing tip number 8?
I'm not, but it could just be my computer.
I see tip number 8, Kelsey.
Awesome, perfect.
Cool. So it might be helpful to assign a specific team member who will be responsible for organizing and distributing things like meeting agendas, minutes, and field reports. This is an extra burden, so when you look at staffing for these projects, you'll want to consider who's best positioned for that role. It might be your architect, or it might be the contractor, or somebody within your organization as an owner's representative, but whoever it is, just make sure that they're prepared and committed to filling that role throughout the project. It's important to record not only what was decided, but why you all agreed on that course of action. The what is obviously important now as you're executing things, but the why will be important if you need to revisit or reconsider decisions. You don't have to go back and hash these conversations out all over again. It might be useful to leverage technology. Dropbox and Google Drive are 2 great platforms to share these records, the most current drawing set, and progress photos with the entire team. Meeting notes are most useful when people can all access and reference them really easily. And along those lines, it might be helpful to enforce a strict standard file naming system, something that includes the date in the file name, because the date modified can get thrown off if you send or download files. This might seem like a really small detail, but it can actually make a really big difference when you're trying to find things quickly, as you're on a call or out on site and you're trying to reference information. So this will help make sure that your files are easily searchable and archived.
So during my fellowship, I worked on a small commercial space renovation. Nothing fancy, just around 3,000 square feet. The project was somewhat complicated by the funding sources, but ended up taking 5 years to complete due to a host of reasons, mainly focusing on lack of recorded communication from the initial team that worked on the project. Between leadership transitions and staff changes, the project decisions and history were very hard to track. So our team ended up spending way more time than we should have to investigate the project history. And ultimately, we ended up spending more money because we had to redo a lot of work that was already done because we couldn't find things and we didn't know what had happened. So this is a really important tip.
Thanks, Leah. So tip number 9, conflicts are inevitable, but animosity isn't. Again, no project or set of plans will ever be perfect, but understanding that from the beginning and having a plan in place for when those conflicts do happen can help keep disagreements from getting personal. Being prepared for conflict can help reduce stress for you and your team. So a couple ways you can do that. Again, during that project kickoff meeting or even during interviews, talk to your team about their quality assurance and quality control protocols, or QA/QC. If they have these protocols in place, it can help minimize missing information, conflicts between drawings and specifications, and coordination errors between architectural and engineering drawings. This is a good thing to not only ask about up front, but revisit as you start to move into construction. And when conflicts do happen, again, remember that nothing is personal. You're all on the same team dedicated to the success of your building. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who came up with the best idea or solution, just that it was the right move for the project. And finally, tip number 10, don't stop short. At the end of a very long development process, it can be tempting to just turn the project over to operations or the home buyer or the new resident. But if you stop there, you might miss out on some of the most important returns on your investment. It's obviously important to pause and celebrate a job well done with your design team, especially if this is a team that you plan to work with again. The trust and relationships that you've generated are an investment in your future projects. So break out the bubbly and congratulate your team. It's good to try and put a post-mortem meeting with your project team on the calendar a few weeks after substantial completion. This will allow you to really discuss things like budget, timeline, communication, and conflict resolution. You can set the tone at this meeting for people to be open and honest about how things really went, and make sure that you talk about both the positives, the successes, and the shortcomings and where things didn't go the way that you wanted them to be. You can model this behavior by asking your design team for the kind of feedback that you want other team members to give each other, and be open to ways that you can work to be a better client too. And then plan for post-occupancy evaluations. It's good to do this around the 10-month mark because this gives people enough time to live in the building and form opinions about it, but you'll also stay within the contractor's 1-year warranty. So a couple things to consider for post-occupancies would be surveying residents and staff about both the experience living in the building and the maintenance and operations of it. And then you can also do more quantitative things like completing energy audits. So it might be good to talk with your design team and your contractor either upfront or at that postmortem and figure out what you really want to be measuring as the building kind of lives its first year. So we know that that was a lot to take in and a lot to consider during your project, but we hope that you'll be able to implement some of these strategies over the course of several months or even years. So in order to keep this all handy, we've created this reference guide to keep close by and remind you of each of these tips. This is part of the download available on the Enterprise Resource Library, and that will be emailed to all attendees.
So Kelsey, we had a couple more questions on that last section as well. Do I need to pay my architect to revise the drawings, or can I just make changes in the field with the builder?
I think it depends on how big of a change we're talking about. Some things can be handled by what are called ASIs, Architectural Supplemental Instructions, or requests for additional information. So if the contractor just has a question that the architect can help clarify, it might be a simple sketch or just a written response. If it's something that is going to involve a lot more kind of redesign, you might see an additional fee that comes with that. And again, that goes back to some of the things that Leah mentioned earlier about making sure that those things are ironed out in the beginning and that your program is set from the start so that you don't run into those kinds of major changes during construction.
Awesome. I think it's also important, I'm just going to say one other thing about that, that at a minimum, having your architect revise your drawings properly if there are changes could save thousands down the road in change orders at a minimum. And then at a maximum, it could potentially save you a lot more later if there are lawsuits down the road related to uncoordinated field changes. Because if you're starting to change major things in the field, you really need to be coordinating with all of the trades who are impacted by those changes so that there aren't issues, especially if details need to be revised and things like that.
Awesome. We had another question. If you have an internal design team, but with limited capacity for larger projects, what are the best practices you've seen for an internal team to work with contractors? It would also be, when do you need the external design help to complement that?
Yeah, so I think in regards to that question, it depends on, is your internal design team licensed? Do they have that capability of producing construction documents and carrying it throughout from initial SD to CDs? If you don't have that capability, then you need to get an external design team. Your internal design team can help you with design coordination and facilitating, the design aesthetics and design idea that the company or your organization wants to achieve. They're really important. It's really good to have that because not a lot of organizations have someone with that knowledge and expertise to communicate what it is that they're trying to envision with the design team to get it to be executed as completely and as clearly as they want. So it really depends on those dynamics.
That's great. And a separate question. What have you learned from post-mortem meetings or post-occupancy evaluations?
I can speak to that. So we recently finished a project, I guess back in September now. And so we did a post-mortem for the first time. We sat down with our contractor and our architect and our internal design team. And one of the things that we learned from that, because our organization is a nonprofit, we had been doing a lot of the procurement in order to take advantage of our tax exempt status. But we learned that even though we were saving money on the taxes, it was costing the project more because our contractor had to put a lot more effort in to essentially managing that process. And we hadn't accounted for the risk of delays and mistakes in that ordering process that is typically really handled by the contractor. So at the end, it ended up that it wasn't worth it for us to continue to do that on future projects. And I don't think that's something that we would have realized just from the way that the project happened. And we also learned more about kind of our team dynamic. There were a couple of instances on site where there was a conflict between the drawing and site conditions and, what our ultimate goal was. And being able to sit down and talk about those things kind of outside of the heat of the moment really helped us work through the strategies that we could deploy in the future to both avoid those things up front and then handle them more productively in the field.
Another question for you, Kelsey. I know that you guys have used a variety of architects at Urban Housing Solutions, and you've chosen to really diversify them. What has that process been like, and what is the process of advocating to spend a little bit more on your architect? As people sort of see these tips and maybe thinking like, yeah, maybe my architect isn't performing exactly the way I want, and I'm not sure that even these tips will help. What is that process of really seeking out different firms and also making the case internally that it's worth the money?
That's a great question. So there were a couple of different factors that led us to, diversify. One of them was just the number of projects. We had multiple different properties in the works in our pipeline at once, and having the same one person be our designer on multiple projects felt like we were spreading things a little bit thin. So that was one factor. And then the change in end user, again, we wanted to make sure that we were focusing on the specific needs of the residents that we were going to be serving and bring additional experience to that. And then just recognizing that we had an opportunity to really invest in kind of our learning and our capacity. So by getting different perspectives, it sort of allowed our internal team on the next project to consider things that we hadn't been looking at before because our architect hadn't asked us about them before. So we're kind of building our own internal capacity as we work with different designers to just think a little bit differently about how we approach new projects.
And I can speak to that as well. Looking back some of the previous projects this class has done with a previous architect versus some of the ones we have now, it comes down to a good architect will also challenge you to be a better developer too. They will ask good questions and they will bring about new ideas and perspectives that you didn't think about. Whereas an architect that you're familiar with, they know you so well that sometimes they'll give you the same thing that you're used to and may not always open you up to, a different new dialogue about, new design solutions and options. So paying extra and venturing out for a new designer provides a lot of opportunities, a lot of growth, and a lot of insight into how you as a developer can be better and providing a better product and better overall quality of a product too, and also help to reshape your image too. Like when you put out a product out there, you know, housing, commercial building, you want that to reflect you. And so if you're growing and changing, then you need someone who can match that as well. So don't be scared to venture out there. You know, times are changing, so do that extra work and allow someone else to come in and challenge you as well.
Carrie, I think you're muted.
Okay, carry on. One of the most important, so this was a question in the chat box, one of the most important design build is to pick your construction manager at the same time as you pick your architect. That way the team starts working together earlier and can lower costs and help the architect not go down any round paths. Please share any thoughts you have on this.
I can talk a little bit about this. I think that is an excellent point. We often try to convince clients to bring on a CM or a contractor early on in the project so that we can talk through budget, talk through the full development budget, make sure that everything is in the right categories, and also having a CM or a contractor on board early at the same time as you pick your architect allows you to talk through, as the architect, to talk through details, you know, questions that your property managers might have about durability, you know, lifespans of building products. Like there's a whole host of benefits to having your CM on board early on. They will also help you manage the bidding process and all of that. So I think that this is a really good point and definitely useful to bring a CM on early, especially for larger projects.
Awesome. Thanks for that question, James. I guess just one last question before we wrap this show up. For each of you, you know, you all were working as architects before you went to work for developers. I'm curious, what was your biggest surprise when you crossed over to the other side? I haven't given you this question in advance, so we'll see what you have to say.
I think one thing that surprised me, I came into this role from a commercial architecture environment and working with developers from the design side. And I think moving to my organization and my new role, I was surprised by how little pushback there was against any kind of, like Leah said earlier, question everything. So if something doesn't look right or feel right, ask about it. And I was surprised by how many things were just taken as, well, the architect said so, so it must be the right answer. And I think it does kind of come back to that confidence of saying, you know your project and you know your end user and you know your community and your budget. So trust yourself to add a little resistance, because that friction, I think, can sometimes be really healthy to make the project stronger.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kelsey. I also noticed that when I started working at the beginning of my fellowship, that there wasn't a lot of pushback. And another thing that I noticed was like an unwillingness to really dive into the construction drawings and really try to understand them and create consensus around design decisions throughout the organization. When you're working in a larger community development corporation, nonprofit, there's a lot of users. There's a lot of end users. There's a lot of, you're operating the building. So it's difficult to get everyone on the same page, to be involved in communicating throughout the entire design process. But I think this is really, really, really important because ultimately, like we said earlier, as the developer, you're the one who owns the building, usually in the long term. So you're the one who has to be comfortable with the decisions that are being made throughout design. And, as your project becomes delivered, you don't want, your property manager or your residents to be surprised at, what shows up in the building. I think that, having a communication plan is very, very important for the whole team to really understand what's happening in throughout the design process.
Yeah, and for me, one of the things I was surprised about is just sometimes the lack of understanding the value of an architect, and having to have that conversation with the development team, with my organization, of like, this isn't something you can, just bypass, overlook, or, you really need to put in the money and make sure your budget, to have a good product, a good end product, and to really advocate for that, coming from an architectural background, and be able to, advocate for my fellow designers was important and is important. And not just for architects, but for built environment, period. So I think that was one thing I had to learn how to do and be mindful of.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for sharing all of this today. I think you have one more slide, Kelsey. And thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions that we didn't get to today, or you think of something later, please feel free to reach out to any of us, connect on LinkedIn, and we're happy to continue this conversation. And thank you for joining us today.
We will, as soon as the resource goes live on the Enterprise website, we'll send out an email with this recording, the slides, and a link to the resource. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.